I discovered my father's secret half-brother, and the truth changed our family forever. Reddit stories. When I was a child, our house never felt like a battlefield, but it never felt like a home either. We weren't one of those families that screamed at each other through the walls, nor were we the kind that sat around a dinner table laughing at old memories. We lived somewhere in the in-between, a polite, fragile balance of distant affection and unspoken tension. My father was the kind of man whose presence filled a room not by volume but by weight. You could feel when he entered, and more importantly, you could feel what you weren't allowed to say. My mother, soft-spoken and almost translucent in her movements, seemed like she had been tiptoeing through life for years, especially around him. My brother Jeremy and I coped differently. He escaped the house as often as he could, joining every after-school activity imaginable, while I retreated inward to books, locked doors, and journaling in notebooks I hid under loose floorboards. We weren't abused, at least not in any way that could be documented or photographed. But emotional distance has its own kind of erosion, subtle and slow, until one day you realize something has been hollowed out. Years passed. Jeremy went off to college out of state and never looked back. I stayed closer, partly out of guilt, and partly because I didn't know what else to do. I told myself I had to take care of Mom after Dad's stroke. He didn't die. Life isn't that poetic, but he became a quieter version of himself. Still imposing, still distant, but now accompanied by a cane and a slower walk. The stroke didn't soften him, just muted his volume. It was during one of those unbearably silent weekends when I came home to visit, the kind filled with awkward glances and the sound of silverware against porcelain, that I stumbled on something that didn't belong. My childhood room had been converted into a storage space, mostly filled with unopened boxes labeled in my mother's delicate script. I was looking for an old coat when I decided to check the attic, which hadn't been touched in years. It wasn't sealed with cobwebs or anything cinematic, just dusty and forgettable. But behind a row of plastic bins filled with holiday decorations, I found a box labeled Robert, 1986. Robert is my father's name. The date caught my attention. 1986 was the year before he married my mother. Curiosity overruled guilt, and I pried it open. Inside were photographs, letters, and receipts bundled together with a rubber band that had long since dried out and snapped. There was nothing overtly scandalous at first. A few old photos of my father looking shockingly happy, holding hands with a woman who wasn't my mother. They stood in front of a small house, somewhere rural judging by the dirt road. She had bright eyes, curly hair, and a laugh that seemed to echo out of the photograph itself. Her name, written in pen on the back of one photo. To Robert, always. L. The letters were folded carefully. I only read one at first out of shame, but it was enough. Rob, if you're reading this, it means you never came back. It means I've had to make decisions alone without you. I won't hate you for that, even if I want to. I won't hide anything. You should know, your son has your eyes. I named him Ely. I told myself I wouldn't, but I did. Maybe someday he'll want to know who you are. Maybe someday you'll care. I sat there for hours numb. A second family. A son. Before us. Before Mom. I didn't confront him that night. I couldn't even look at him during dinner. The man who had raised me in silence had harbored a secret so loud it made my ears ring. I left early the next morning, my mind churning like a machine stuck in reverse. I spent the next week looking for Ely. Social media, old records. I tried to search quietly, not knowing what I'd do if I actually found him. But then, almost by accident, I did. He was a musician based in Oregon, and the resemblance was undeniable. Same jawline, same uneven dimples. His bio mentioned he was raised by a single mom. I stared at his profile for what felt like days. He had a life. A whole life filled with music, friends, photos of mountains and dogs, and vinyl records. I had memorized his face before I even dared to message him. My fingers hovered over the keyboard like they were afraid of what the truth might type. Eventually, I did. Something simple. "Hey, this might sound strange, but I think we might be related." I didn't expect a reply. He answered an hour later. "That's a hell of an opening line. Related how?" I told him everything. Well, almost everything. I didn't tell him about the letter or the photos, not yet. Just the basics: my father's name, the timeline, the resemblance. He didn't block me. He didn't accuse me of lying. He just said, my mom's name was Lillian. She died 10 years ago. She never told me anything about my dad except his name, Robert. It was like unlocking a sealed vault. One message turned into dozens, then a phone call, then another. We were both nervous, both afraid of what we were doing. But curiosity is a kind of gravity. Eventually, we agreed to meet. I didn't tell my parents. I drove 8 hours and met him at a small coffee shop that smelled like roasted hazelnut and old wood. He was already there when I walked in, sitting with a black notebook and a cup of tea. When he looked up, the recognition hit us both like a gut punch. He stood up and we just stared. There's no protocol for moments like this. Finally, he smiled, awkward and genuine. "So you're my brother?"
Wow.
And just like that, a world I thought I knew cracked open. We didn't hug. That would have been too cinematic, too immediate for the surreal weight that settled over the table between us. Instead, we just sat, clumsily sipping our drinks like strangers on a first date who had already learned they shared DNA. Illy talked first. He had an easy way about him, the kind of unguarded rhythm in his voice that made you want to listen even if you didn't understand what he was saying. I found myself watching him more than hearing him at first. The way he raised his eyebrows when he made a point. The way his fingers drummed on the table like he was trying to keep a tempo even in silence. The resemblance to our father was uncanny, but there was something freer in him, something that hadn't been locked away. He told me about growing up in a small Oregon town, raised by Lillian, the woman in the photographs. She was a music teacher, played cello, had a laugh that made people turn around in grocery stores. She never married, never dated much either. She told Ellie that love had left her early, and she had never bothered to chase it again. The most she ever said about his father was that his name was Robert, that he was passionate and brilliant, and left like a thief in the morning. No goodbye, no explanation. She never badmouthed him. That was the part that broke me. She could have poisoned Ellie against him, could have made him hate our father, but she didn't. She just let silence grow roots. Eli had questions, of course. Why did Robert leave? Did he ever talk about her? Did he know about me? I answered honestly when I could and shrugged when I couldn't. I told him about our family, about the cold dinners and the paper, then conversations about our mom who walked on eggshells and a brother who ran for the hills. I told him our father was never violent, just absent in all the ways that matter. He was a shadow with a neck-tie, I said. Ely nodded like he understood. We talked for hours, and by the time the cafe closed, it felt like I had known him my whole life and not at all. We stood outside in the cool air, the sky washed in deep blue and city glow. There was a pause where we didn't know how to end it, and then Ellie reached into his bag and pulled out a photograph. It was old, folded and worn, and when he handed it to me, I saw a toddler, maybe 3 years old, sitting on Lillian's lap. Her eyes were the same as the ones in the attic photo. The boy had Robert's face, Robert's jawline, and in the corner, written faintly in pencil, "For him, if he ever asks." I kept up that photo. I told Eli I didn't know what I was going to do yet, if I'd confront our father or keep pretending nothing had changed. He said he understood, but I could tell he hoped I'd do something. Anything. We said goodbye with the kind of awkwardness that only new siblings can have. Not quite a handshake, not quite a hug. I got in my car and drove home in silence, the photograph on the passenger seat like a secret that had finally found a voice. The next few days were unbearable. Every conversation with my father felt like an act. I kept watching him for some hint, some flicker of regret or memory, or anything that might betray what I now knew. But he was the same as always, methodical, curt, buried in the newspaper like the world outside didn't exist. I started to wonder if he'd buried it all so deep he'd forgotten. Or maybe he remembered everything and just didn't care. One night, I found my mother alone in the kitchen, drying dishes with a dish towel that had frayed edges. She looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed before, like the years had finally caught up with her all at once. I asked her if she remembered a woman named Lillian. Her hands froze mid-motion. She turned slowly, the towel still in her grip. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked. I told her the truth, or most of it, that I had found something in the attic, that I had questions. She sat down at the table, the same table where I had eaten thousands of meals in silence, and for the first time in my life she talked. Not just surface-level words, but real ones. She told me she met my father in 1987. He was charming, intense, a man who made her feel like she was the only person in a crowded room. He never mentioned Lillian. Never mentioned a child. But she wasn't blind. A few years into the marriage, she found a letter hidden in a book he'd brought back from a business trip. It was unsigned, but it was clear it was from someone who had once loved him. He never talked about the past, she said, and I was too afraid to ask. I asked her why she stayed, why she let him build this family on top of lies. She looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they were. "Because I was already pregnant with you." And I told myself love could be learned. That silence was better than being alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things that never got said in this house. I thought about Lillian raising a child alone. I thought about my mother choosing a half-life because she thought it was safer. And I thought about my father, the man in the photographs, and the man in the living room, and how far apart those two people seemed. The next morning, I did something reckless. I printed out the photo Ellie gave me and slid it into an envelope with a note that just said, "Did you ever wonder what he looks like now?" I left it on my father's desk, next to his crossword puzzle and morning coffee mug. Then I left the house before he woke up. He didn't call. Not that day, not the next. For a week, I heard nothing. I started to wonder if he'd thrown it away, or worse, if it had broken something beyond repair. But on the 8th day, he called me. His voice was quiet, flat. "Come over," he said. "No." When I arrived, he was sitting in the living room, the envelope on his lap, the photo beside it. He didn't look at me when I sat down. For a long time, he just stared at the image like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve. And then, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, "He has her eyes." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an admission. But it was the first time I'd ever heard my father speak of the past like it was something real. He told me everything. In his own way. That he met Lillian when he was young and stupid, that he panicked when she got pregnant, that he told himself he wasn't ready. He moved, changed numbers, buried the past like a body. When he met my mother, he thought he could start over. He thought time would erase guilt. But it doesn't, does it? I asked. He shook his head. No, it just hides in photographs you hope no one ever finds. I asked him if he wanted to meet Ely. He didn't answer. Just stared at the photo, his hand shaking ever so slightly. Eventually, he said, "If he hates me, I won't blame him." It wasn't the moment I had imagined. No grand confrontation, no tearful reunion. Just two people sitting in a room, both realizing they had built their lives on the sand. I left without pressing him. He needed to decide on his own. When I called Ely later that night, I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. "I don't need a father," he said finally. "But maybe I could use a brother." That was enough for now. Eli and I started talking every day after that. Not always about the heavy stuff. Sometimes it was music, or movies, or childhood stories we each assumed the other would find boring, until we realized how strange and novel it was to hear them. I told him about the time I broke my arm falling out of the apple tree in our backyard. And he told me about a prank he pulled in high school involving an entire marching band and a confused goat. We compared notes on Robert like detectives comparing witness statements. Same man, different crimes. I started to wonder how many versions of our father existed in the world, how many lives he had brushed against without fully touching. Our connection wasn't instant magic. There were awkward moments, too. Moments where I said something that reminded him I grew up with a dad who was at least physically present, while he had nothing but a fading name and a mother's fading smile. There was a quiet jealousy there, not ugly or loud, but present all the same. And sometimes, when Ellie talked about his mom, I'd feel a similar sting. Lillian sounded like the kind of mother who sang lullabies and remembered your friends' names, the kind who danced barefoot in the kitchen. Our mom was kind, but tired, loving but distant. I envied his warmth just as he envied my shadow. One day, Ailey texted May. "What if we met again, but this time in your town? Let me see your world." I stared at the message for a while, unsure if I was ready to pull that curtain back. But part of me knew it was time. If we were going to have anything real, he needed to see where I came from. The house, the silences, the weathered furniture and ghosts in the wallpaper. He arrived on a Friday. I picked him up from the train station, and the ride back was a mix of nervous laughter and mapless conversation. The city blurred past us in shades of gray and brick. He was quieter this time, taking everything in. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, he didn't get out immediately. He just stared at the house like it was a museum. "It looks frozen," he said finally. "It is," I replied. "That's kind of its thing." Inside, my mother was already setting out tea, like hosting a surprise half. Brother was just another line on her to-do list. She didn't say much, but her eyes lingered on Ellie longer than they did on most guests. There was a flicker of something in her. Curiosity, maybe even guilt, though I couldn't be sure. She didn't ask questions, but she watched. And when she thought no one was looking, she smiled at him in a way I hadn't seen in years. My father wasn't there. He was out. Or avoiding, likely both. We didn't plan it, but somehow we ended up walking through the neighborhood after tea. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I pointed out old landmarks from our childhood. The tree Jeremy and I used to climb, the corner where the ice cream truck always stopped, the fence we accidentally set on fire one 4th of July. Ely laughed in disbelief. "You really did all the classic stuff, huh?" "Yeah," I said, except we never talked about any of it. It just happened, then vanished. When we got back, the lights were on. My father's car was in the driveway. My stomach sank. This was the moment. No more buffer, no more preparation. Ellie noticed too. He stopped at the foot of the stairs. "You sure?" he asked. "Nope," I said. "But we're doing it anyway." Inside, my father was in his chair. The one he'd claimed since before I was born. He looked up as we entered, and for the first time in my life, I saw something that might have been fear behind his eyes. Ely stood tall, not aggressive, just present. My father set down his newspaper with deliberate slowness. "You must be Ellie," he said. Ellie didn't speak right away. He was looking at my father like someone trying to reconcile a ghost with the real thing. Finally, he said, "Yeah, that's me." There was a silence that could fill a cathedral. "Wasn't sure you'd come," my father said. "Well, I wasn't sure you'd stay," Ely replied. That cracked something. My father nodded slowly, almost like he was accepting a verdict. "Fair enough." They talked. I didn't expect it to happen like that. Not without shouting, not without accusations, but it was more like two men circling the same crater, trying to make sense of the blast pattern. My father didn't apologize, not directly. But he said things I never thought he could say. That he was scared, that he was selfish, that he made a choice, and then built a life around pretending it hadn't been one. He admitted to thinking about Ellie more times than he could count. He admitted to wondering what kind of man he had become. He admitted he never thought he deserved to know. Ella listened. He didn't forgive. Not that night, maybe not ever. But he listened. That was enough. Afterward, we sat on the porch, the three of us not saying much, just breathing the same air. My mother watched from the kitchen window. She didn't come out, but she didn't look away either. When Ely finally left the next morning, we didn't hug again, but he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "We should do this again. Maybe next time without the tension." I don't think we know how to do anything without tension. I joked. He smiled. "We'll learn." And then he was gone. In the weeks that followed, something strange happened. My father started changing. Not drastically. He was still him, still stubborn and quiet, but the air around him softened. He asked questions, small ones at first. "How's work? You still seeing that girl?" But the fact that he asked it all was a shift in gravity. One day, he even mentioned Ely by name. Think he'd come back for dinner sometime. "I think he would," I said. We weren't healed. Families like ours don't snap back into place like rubber bands. But something had cracked, and in the space where the fracture had been, something new was starting to grow. Then, 2 months later, I got a package in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting on the label immediately. It was Ella's. Inside was a vinyl record, a demo. His voice, raw and emotional, filled the room as I set it on the turntable. The lyrics were simple but devastating. "You can't rewrite the start it, but maybe you can meet me halfway between the silence and the sound between the lost and the found." Tucked inside the sleeve was a note. One line. For the brother I didn't know I needed. And just like that, the silence we grew up with had a new kind of echo. One that didn't feel so empty anymore. After the record, something shifted in me. I had spent so many years trying not to become my father that I didn't realize how much of him I'd already absorbed. The emotional hesitation, the distance, the need to keep every vulnerable thought tucked away in the back of my throat. But Ely, he made it clear without ever saying it, connection is a choice. And I was tired of choosing distance. I started visiting him. At first it was casual, a weekend here and there, and then it turned into something we planned for. He lived in a small but cozy apartment above a bookstore in Portland. It smelled like old paper, strong coffee, and pinewood incense. His world was vastly different from mine. Organic groceries, vintage posters, handmade mugs. It felt like I was stepping into a life someone had consciously curated instead of one built out of obligation. He played small venues. Bars, street festivals, even the occasional rooftop show. I watched from the back, unnoticed, watching a brother I'd only just begun to know take ownership of a stage like he was born for it. One night after a gig, we ended up on his balcony with 2 beers and a silence that felt nothing like the ones back home. "You ever wonder what life would have been like if he stayed?" he asked. I thought about it a lot, actually. Yeah. But then I wonder if you and I would have ended up like Jeremy and me, related but orbiting completely different planets. He nodded. Yeah. I guess there's no guarantee he wouldn't have messed us both up in the same house instead of separately. I laughed, and he did too. That was our way. Cut the heaviness with sarcasm and a shrug. But that night I also realized something else. I wasn't just getting to know Ely. I was seeing a version of myself I might become if life had been just a little different. He was more open, more trusting. He said what he felt and didn't apologize for it. He lived with both hands open while I was still learning to unclench one. One morning he took me hiking. I wasn't the outdoorsy type, but he insisted. The trail was steep, the air crisp, and the silence between us was filled with bird calls and rustling leaves. When we got to the summit, he pulled something from his backpack, a photo. The same one from the attic of our father and Lillian. Only this time it had been reprinted and framed. "I've been thinking about her a lot lately," he said. About how much she carried, about how little she asked for in return. I didn't know what to say, so I said the only thing that felt honest. "She raised a good man." He smiled, and for the first time, I saw his eyes well up. He didn't wipe them. He just let them be. After that trip, I went home changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. I called Jeremy. We hadn't spoken in years outside of birthdays and the occasional group text about Mom's health. He answered on the second ring, surprised but not hostile. I said. I know we don't talk much, but I think we should. There's a lot I never told you. There was a pause. Like what? I told him everything. About Ailey. About the attic. About the conversation with Dad. At first, he thought I was joking. Then he thought I was lying. Finally, when the disbelief wore off, he was quiet. I always knew there was something off about him, Jeremy said. But I didn't think he had a whole secret life. He didn't. He had a secret child. There's a difference. Still, he said, that's a hell of a thing to bury. We talked for an hour. More than we had in the last 5 years combined. And when we hung up, I didn't feel lighter. I felt aligned, like the pieces were finally where they were supposed to be, even if the image was complicated. Back at home, things kept shifting. Slowly, like furniture being moved 1 inch each day. My mother started asking about Ely. She asked if he was kind, if he looked like Robert, if he was happy. He's all of those things, I said. But mostly he's real, and he's ours. She didn't cry, but she did sit down and stare out the window for a long time, like she was talking to ghosts. And my father, he started writing letters. Not to me, not to Ely either, not at first. Just letters folded into a leather-bound journal he kept on his nightstand. I never asked what was in them. I figured if he ever wanted us to know, he'd show us. One day, he did. He called me into his study, handed me the journal, and said, "You can read them when you're ready." The first letter was dated the day after Ely left our house. It started with, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway." It was raw, honest in a way I didn't think he was capable of. He wrote about the fear that made him run, the shame that made him lie, and the weight of watching a son he never knew sit across from him, carrying 27 years of absence like a backpack full of stones. There were over a dozen letters, some angry, some apologetic, some meandering. All of them were real. I scanned each one and sent them to Ela. He called me the next morning, his voice quiet. "Tell him I'll write back, but it'll take time." And that was enough. That fall, Eli came back, not for a visit. He moved, said he needed a change of scenery, that he wanted to be closer to the story he never got to be part of. He got a job at a local studio and started playing gigs in town. People loved him, his music, his vibe. Jeremy even came to one of the shows. They met after, awkward at first, but warming up quickly. Jeremy slapped him on the back and said, "Guess I'm not the oldest anymore?" "Nope," Ely grinned. "But I'm the coolest." They laughed. So did I. For once, we all did. Christmas that year was different. Not perfect. There were still moments of quiet, still shadows on the walls. But we were all there, around the same table. Eli brought a dish Lillian used to make, a cheesy potato casserole she called funeral potatoes, because she always made them when people were sad. Figured we could reclaim it, Ellie said. Eat it while happy. For once we did, and it was delicious. After dinner, I found my father in the den, staring at the fire. I sat next to him, and for a long time we didn't speak. Finally, he said, "I don't deserve this." "No," I said. "But we don't always get what we deserve. Sometimes we get what we fight for." He nodded slowly, like that was a new idea he hadn't considered. "I'm trying," he said. "I know," I replied. And for once, I believed it. Ely stayed that night, slept on the couch just like any other brother might. In the morning, I found a note in the kitchen written in his messy scrawl. "We can't undo the past, but maybe we can build something on top of it. Something real, something good." I folded it up and put it in my wallet, right next to the photo from the attic. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. It's strange how quickly something broken can start to resemble something whole again, even if the cracks are still visible. The months after Christmas passed in a rhythm I hadn't known my family was capable of. Ely was around more, coming by for dinner, joining us for weekend hikes, and sometimes just showing up with a guitar slung over his shoulder and a bag of groceries no one asked him to bring. And my father, the man who used to disappear behind newspapers and television static, began to exist in the room with us, not just beside us. The letters between them continued. Ellie never called them replies, though. Letters are for honesty, he said. Phone calls are for pretending. He didn't say it with bitterness. It was just a truth he carried, and he carried it well. My father kept each envelope in a wooden box he dusted regularly but never locked. That alone said something. What none of us expected was how the town would react. It wasn't a big place. Word got around fast. People noticed Ely and asked who he was. At first, it was easy enough to say he was a family friend, a cousin, a musician staying nearby. But eventually, the truth made its way out. Not in a scandalous way. There were no whispers behind curtains or gossip columns, but in the way small towns digest anything unfamiliar, with curiosity dressed as politeness. An old neighbor of ours, Mrs. Langford, stopped me outside the grocery store one afternoon. She was the type of woman who baked when she wanted to apologize and volunteered at every blood drive for the socialization. "I saw you and that young man at the farmer's market," she said, eyes twinkling with a kind of nosiness she called concern. "Your brother, is he?" I hesitated only a second. "Yeah, he is," she nodded slowly. "Well, he looks like your father. And I always say the more family, the better, especially these days. You tell him I make a mean peach cobbler if he ever wants a taste of town hospitality." People adjusted. That's the thing I learned. Families don't have to be perfect to be accepted, just consistent, and we were becoming that. Not without friction, of course. Jeremy still kept his distance more often than not, claiming work or kids or house repairs. But even he was softening. He and Ellie started texting occasionally, sharing dumb memes, planning a guy's night that kept getting postponed, but at least they talked about it. Then spring came, and with it came the idea that would change everything again. It started with an envelope. Not one of the letters between Ela and our father, but something different. A legal-looking one. I found it on the kitchen table one evening, unopened, with my name on it. Inside was an invitation, Ely's application for a name change. He wasn't dropping anything, just adding Ely Morgan Langston, our last name. There was a sticky note attached. "Hope this doesn't weird you out. Just feels like it's time. I want to belong to something, to someone." I didn't know how to process it at first. A name wasn't just letters. It was a door you opened to the past every time someone said it out loud. It was Thanksgiving dinners and birthday candles and silent car rides. And now it was something he wanted to claim, even knowing how fractured it all was. When I asked him why, he didn't hesitate. "Because I spent my whole life wondering who I was. Now I finally know. And I want that truth to be visible." My father, surprisingly, didn't resist. In fact, he offered to go to the courthouse with him. That morning, I stood between them, watching two men who had started out as strangers sign papers that stitched them together in the eyes of a state that had no clue what they'd been through. When Ellie got his new ID in the mail, we celebrated like it was a birthday. My mother made her famous meatloaf, an oddly formal choice, and we toasted with sparkling cider because Ely didn't drink and my father had stopped years ago without explanation. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch, listening to the frogs and the creaking of wood beneath me. My father joined me, which was rare. We sat in the kind of silence that used to feel suffocating but now felt earned. "He's brave," he said finally. "Braver than I ever was." "Yeah," I agreed. "But you let him in. That counts for something." He nodded, then looked out into the darkness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed? With Lillian, I mean." I considered the question. Yeah. But then maybe I wouldn't be here. Maybe Ely wouldn't be who he is. Maybe we'd all be worse off, just in a different way. "Maybe," he said softly. "Or maybe I just wasn't ready to be a good man. That doesn't mean you can't become one." He didn't reply, but the way he exhaled told me he heard it. As summer approached, the idea came up for a trip. Ely suggested it first, a kind of found family retreat, as he called it. He wanted to see the places our dad remembered from childhood. Old fishing spots, the roadside diner he always mentioned but never took us to. At first, I thought it was a bad idea. Forced bonding always had a way of exploding. But Ely was persistent, and surprisingly, so was our father, so we rented a cabin up north. Jeremy agreed to come too, bringing his oldest kid, Max, who was 9 and dangerously obsessed with frogs. My mom stayed behind, claiming it sounded too rustic. I suspected she just wanted a weekend to herself, which she absolutely deserved. The trip was strange. Beautiful, awkward, healing. We played cards, roasted marshmallows, tried fishing badly, and took turns telling stories around the fire. Some true, some wildly exaggerated. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father laugh so hard he cried. Max, oblivious to everything except amphibians and s'mores, kept calling Ellie Uncle Froggy, a name that stuck far too quickly. Jeremy and Ellie bonded over bad cooking and worse jokes. And one night, while staring at the stars, I realized we had done it. Somehow, despite the broken start, the missing years, the silence and shame, we had made a family. Not perfect, never perfect, but real. Ellie wrote a song about the trip. He played it at a local show a few weeks later, and this time, all of us were there. My father in the front row, my mother tapping her foot quietly, Jeremy holding Max on his lap. The lyrics were simple, like all the best won us. We are the sum of every choice sieve, the quiet tears, the softened voice you, we are the cracks that let light in sit, the story buried in the skin. The crowd clapped politely, but our row was the loudest, and afterward, Ellie came down and hugged each of us, not just a nod or a shoulder tap. A real hug, firm, grateful, long overdue. Later that night, he pulled me aside. You know, he said, when I was a kid, I used to imagine my dad was some kind of secret agent. Gun to protect the world or something. Anything but a coward. I waited. But now I think the truth might actually be better. Because this version of him, the one who messed up but stayed to fix it, he's not a fantasy. He's mine. We didn't need to say anything after that. Just stood there, side by side, watching our father help Max chase fireflies in the dark. A man who once ran from everything now reaching out to catch small glowing things, laughing as he missed, and trying again anyway. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those utterly ordinary days that don't even feel like they deserve a memory. The sun was out, the breeze was soft and life. Our strange, stitched together version of it was finally undeniably good. Ely had been planning a small concert at the local arts center, nothing big, just a fundraiser for the school's music program. Jeremy had agreed to help run the lights. Dad even joked about volunteering as security, which, given his cane and cardigan, had made everyone laugh. The morning started with a phone call, not from Ely, not from Jeremy, from the hospital. My father had collapsed in the kitchen. My mother found him halfway between the fridge and the table, a coffee mug shattered at his feet. By the time I got there, it was already too late. Heart failure, they said. Sudden peaceful. Nothing he could have done. That's what people always say. As if anything sudden can be peaceful. The funeral was small but packed. People from all corners of his life showed up. Neighbors, former co-workers, even the owner of that ancient diner he'd taken us to just once during the trip. My mother sat silent, a crumpled tissue in her lap, her lips tight with every kind of emotion she had spent a lifetime hiding. Jeremy handled most of the arrangements, quietly efficient. Ely sang. It wasn't a traditional hymn or anything you'd expect at a church gathering. Just his guitar and a voice that cracked once, twice, before settling into something steady. The song didn't have a name, it was new, unfinished. You ran and we ran after id years like photographs, scattered id but you stopped. And we found you in not whole, but trying in not perfect. But ours? No one clapped. No one needed to. Afterward, we went back to the house that still smelled like him, still had his slippers by the back door, still had his crossword half filled out on the kitchen table. Ely sat at the dining room chair he used to avoid, the one my father always claimed. "I keep expecting him to walk in and tell me I'm holding the guitar wrong," he said. "He probably still would," I said. We didn't laugh. Not really. But we smiled. My mother went to bed early that night, said she was tired, and I think we all understood that meant more than just needing sleep. Jeremy sat on the porch with a beer. I found Ely in the attic. He was looking through the old box again, the one from the very beginning. The photos, the letters, the pieces of a life that hadn't made sense until we forced them to. He held up the letter, the original one, the one from Lillian. "You think she knew?" he asked. "Knew what?" "That someday it'd be you who found this. That I'd end up here, with all of you. I didn't know, but I liked to think she had hope, and maybe that's the only thing stronger than certainty. I want to tell her story," he said. "In a song. Not about being abandoned, about being strong enough to raise someone alone, about choosing love anyway." "Oh, she'd like that," I said. The next morning, we found something unexpected. My mother was in the study, going through the wooden box where my father had kept Ellie's letters. Only they weren't just letters anymore. They had been organized, numbered, annotated. There were footnotes, observations, circles around certain words, like he'd been studying them, trying to understand what his son was really saying. And on top of the stack, a sealed envelope, addressed to Ely. We all stood around it like it might explode. Ellie opened it slowly. His hands didn't shake, but I could see the effort it took not to. Inside was a single piece of paper, my father's handwriting, neat and deliberate. "Ellie, I won't pretend this makes up for everything. It doesn't. But I need you to know something. When I first saw you on that porch, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel shame. I felt awe. That you had grown into someone I could only dream of being. That you could look at me, knowing what you know, and still offer me a seat at your table. You gave me something I thought I'd lost the right to a second chance. Thank you for that. And thank you for your music. Your voice filled the house in a way my silence never could. You reminded me that legacy isn't in blood, it's in how you love. If I did one good thing in my life, it was making space for you to come back. I'm proud of you. More than I ever said. More than I ever knew how to say. Dad." No one spoke for a long time. Ali folded the letter and placed it in his guitar case, right beside the photo of him and Lillian. After that, things didn't go back to normal. Because there was no normal to return to. But there was forward. Ellie released an album later that year, called it Cracks in the Frame. The cover was a photo of our father's study window. Foggy, light bleeding in through the edges. The final track was called Letter 15. It was just his voice reading that letter. No music, no instruments, just the truth. Jeremy and I started meeting once a week for lunch. It was awkward at first, but it stuck. Max kept calling Ely Uncle Froggy, and now even strangers referred to him that way at shows. My mother started volunteering again, said helping others made her feel closer to the version of herself she thought she'd lost. And me? I started writing. Not for anyone else, just for me. Journals full of memories I didn't want to forget. Moments I'd overlooked. I wrote down the sound of Ellie's laugh, the warmth of my father's hands the last time I shook them, the smell of that cabin in the woods, the way my mother had smiled at Eli that first day he walked through the door. I kept the very first page for something else, though. A sentence I think I'll carry with me forever. Some families are born, others are built. And ours was forged in silence, mended in truth, and held together not by time, but by the choice to stay. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.